Governments are promoting self-employment for women as a positive route to the economic well-being of states, also promoted by governments of OECD countries as a means of economic recovery from the pandemic. But even before COVID times, the Canadian government was devoting significant resources toward increasing the number of self-employed women in Canada. Their Women in Entrepreneurship strategy was launched in 2018 with the goal of doubling the number of almost 1 million self-employed women in Canada by the year 2025. So that would put us, in other words, 2 million workers. The concern here is that more and more women find themselves in precarious work that is made all the more risky to their health due to having to combine that work with their unpaid caring labor. Ultimately, research points to the likelihood that when solo self-employed women, that means not having any employees. So I'm talking about workers and not employers. When solo self-employed women combine their paid work with unpaid caregiving, they're working at a double threat to their health and well-being. When injury or illness comes into the picture, as it is likely to do, it is difficult for women who are self-employed and who perform a primary caregiving role to a family or community member to either recover or maintain income stability. So this triangle here is obviously showing that, we've got women workers in the middle, women getting drawn into self-employment, encouraged by the government, encouraged by their own ideas of entrepreneurship, or sometimes encouraged by not having any other choices of viable work and wage work. So in the following 3 slides, I'll address some of the most relevant background research on each of the 3 triangle points as they pertain to women workers. The term entrepreneurship still has an aura of success, accomplishment, exciting innovation, and independence, but the fact is that the quality and precarity associated with self-employment varies widely. This has long been described in the context of self-employment in the global south, but it is becoming more recognized that the same can be said of self-employment in the global north too. Self-employment is characterized by similar or even exacerbated occupational segregation compared to waged or salaried workers, or waged and salaried work, meaning that within self-employment, women tend to be concentrated in the lowest paid, most precarious jobs and to suffer the highest cost to their well-being. Research conducted on self-employed women in the gig economy, for instance, found that they tend to quote much lower hourly fees, 37% lower than men after controlling for education level and experience. But not all women in self-employment experience these conditions equally. So in the interest of expanding our understanding about the wide variation of experiences and working conditions within self-employment, this study will focus on the subset of the self-employed, which can be said to be at the highest risk of negative impacts to health. That is, women who are solo self-employed, again, meaning they have no employees, and who are unincorporated. They tend to be the most precarious and to have less human capital upon entry into self-employment and to subsequently earn less than their wage and salaried counterparts. So this group makes up the largest proportion of self-employed women at just over 600,000 as of 2021. Within that group, of course, social location is also a significant factor, with immigrant and racialized women experiencing more precarity and worse working conditions than other women. So the main point to keep in mind going forward is that even without factoring in their unpaid caregiving work, women enter self-employment at a disadvantage, are more likely to face barriers to equal pay, and are more likely to experience precarity in their work. However, when we do factor in the burden of unpaid caring labor that many self-employed women perform, the picture becomes even more concerning. It is well known at this point that women are still performing the majority of the unpaid caring work at a rate of approximately 80%, whether within families, whether as parents to children under 18, or as caregivers to adult children or other ill or aging family members. It is also well established that this work is undervalued, both economically and socially, and that even when not combined with other paid work, is itself hard on women's psychological and emotional health. As a primary caregiver for a child or another family member, this type of work is isolated, exhausting, and invisible. It comes without benefits or the social support of coworkers to mitigate the stress and isolation. It is therefore no surprise that unpaid caregivers are at a higher risk for disease, both short and long term, and take longer to recover from illness, have more frequent hospitalizations when ill, and report higher levels of emotional distress and depression. Caregivers have also been found to experience increased psychiatric symptoms, lowered life satisfaction, and a significant negative association between health and caring that increases with the number of hours of care provided per week. Women caregivers tend to provide more intense care for longer periods and to experience a larger reduction in income than men as a result of their caregiving work. One study found, for instance, that women caregivers reported experiencing difficulty accessing medical care, which they speculate could relate to women caregivers' higher prevalence of chronic disease. So all of this points to the need to examine whether solo self-employment is something that should be promoted to women or that women should pursue when they are seeking to balance paid work with unpaid caregiving labor. So when illness or injury comes into the picture, again, we have another layer of issues. So Prince, for instance, notes that there is a serious gap in income security for workers who experience moderate disabilities or medium-term illness, and that includes the self-employed and non-standard employment workers as particularly vulnerable as a result of these policy gaps. But technically, all self-employed people can opt into state employment insurance called Special Benefits for the Self-Employed through the Canada Employment Insurance Commission. This was a program introduced in 2010, and it provides access to the same benefits for sickness, caretaking leave, disability, or maternity or parental leave as other employed Canadians. That is, up to 55% of their average weekly earnings for a maximum of 45 weeks. But there are some important differences, which some say may explain the very low registration rate into the program. For example, they have to pay, to opt in, you must pay EI premiums for 1 year before being eligible to make a claim. You must show that your income has been reduced by at least 40% due to life-changing events. And once you receive your first benefit as a claimant, you are committed to paying premiums for the rest of their self-employed career. So a study conducted by Employment and Social Development Canada in 2013 found that 2 years after the introduction of this special benefits program, only 4% of the anticipated 318 self-employed workers had opted into the program. 6 years later, a 2019 study found that still only 4% of eligible people had opted into the program, meaning 23,000 self-employed people in Canada are covered by this program out of a roughly eligible, out of the entire population of self-employed. That data I don't have updated, so I won't quote it right now. Looking into this, a 2019 survey conducted by the government questioned non-participants about their reasons for foregoing benefits coverage and found that a lack of awareness of the program, unaffordable premiums, and a low benefit amount were among the reasons for non-participation. A study conducted by Khan et al. In 2021 found that self-employed workers are often unaware of Social Security supports where these are offered. Further research shows that when women do make claims to the program, in over 90% of the cases, these are claims for maternity leave. So all of this begs the question, and I believe an urgent question, what happens when solo self-employed women who are also caregivers experience illness or injury? My research questions arise from this background research and considering this issue from those three angles. In essence, I believe that we need to examine whether when governments encourage women into self-employment, they are pointing women in the direction of work that will be truly beneficial for them and their families, or whether women are being directed and are flocking into forms of work that put them at a high risk for illness and injury without sufficient protection or opportunities for recovery from illness or injury. So here are my research questions. How do women come to combine their unpaid caregiving with solo self-employment? How do they experience the combination of these roles as a good balance between caring and paid labor, or do they experience them that way? How do women perceive the impact of combining solo self-employment with unpaid caregiving to their health and well-being? And what do women caregivers and solo self-employment see as the barriers to accessing supports for health and well-being? In terms of methodology and underlying theory, conceptually, this study starts from the broad framework of gender equality, seeing unpaid care work as distinctly gendered and solo self-employment as characterized by occupational segregation, in part because of care work responsibilities. My theoretical foundation is derived from social reproduction feminism, which is a strand of Marxist feminism that is interested in work that goes beyond paid labor to include unwaged social reproductive and domestic labor. From this viewpoint, public policy is always working to mediate the tension between capital and labor, and this has a direct bearing on households and particularly on women's reproductive labor. Social reproduction feminism is inherently classed, raced, and gendered, and interested in exploring the ways that these systems create intersectionalities of oppression experienced by women across economic, institutional, and social contexts. It also recognizes that women as workers exercise agency and strategically navigate their world of work. So using this lens, I view state and capital as aiming to ensure all unpaid reproductive labor happens in the private sphere, whether it's or low-waged in the private sphere and unpaid in the domestic sphere, particularly in recent decades as part of neoliberal governance techniques. At the same time, the new and accelerated push of women into self-employment where they do not have security, access to retirement or sickness benefits, or collective representation. The result is that women's unpaid and paid work is increasingly privatized, invisible, autonomous, and precarious, a situation which is, of course, detrimental to their health. So through this study, I expect, I'm just going to make trouble. I expect that that I'll find that pathways into the combined roles of solo self-employment and unpaid caregiving are very complex. You know, as mentioned before, women are pushed and pulled into this type of work for many reasons, but increasingly they are being sold into this type of work by a rhetoric that is encouraging them, you know, as a form of independence, ability to balance their caring work, you know, COVID recovery, it's good for the economy, what have you. So pathways will vary along intersectional lines, as well as the nature of the unpaid caregiving. So, you know, in terms of age-related pathways, you know, a woman entering retirement, deciding to take up some sort of self-employment while caring for, you know, a relative is going to have sort of different motivations and reasons for entering this kind of work than, you know, perhaps a younger woman who is trying to balance that work with raising young children, for instance. Participants will subjectively link impacts to health and well-being to their combined solo self-employment and caregiving roles. And I think that participants will report use of mainly family and community informal supports. This has been suggested by previous research, but many will have struggled in this way to maintain income stability, and will have employed various strategies to keep up their caring labor and paid labor. Unfortunately, I think that many of those strategies will be large sacrifices to either their health, to either the nature and type of care that they feel that they would like to provide to the people they look after or feel they need to. Or, you know, they will have a severely reduced income, possibly lose their, you know, self-employment labor or their work, and will experience severe income instability. In terms of the contributions I hope to make, there is a need in the literature to increase the nuance of our understanding of the heterogeneity of precarity and self-employment. Studies up until recently have tended to overlook this significant heterogeneity, whether that's combining, you know, genders together, employers and workers. So, you know, whether it's class heterogeneity that has been overlooked. So, as well as an intersectional lens has not often been applied to these types of studies. So that will be a contribution that I'm making. I'm also focusing on the largest subset of self-employed women, a group that we already know is dealing with higher precarity. So I'm addressing information gaps by focusing specifically on, you know, all the layers of you know, elements of the participants that I'll be working with in terms of their unpaid caregivers. I'm looking at their health and well-being. I'm looking at their subjective experiences. So how do they make sense of where they find themselves professionally as caregivers and in terms of their own individual health and well-being. And I will be doing this in the Canadian context, which is fairly novel. And again, I'll be using an intersectional lens. I also hope to contribute to scholarship that informs future policy. We need to incorporate considerations of caring labor and the lack of protection for self-employed women with short or medium-term illness or injury. And, in the bigger picture overall, self-employment is on the rise, although looking at recent statistics, there has been a significant drop across all categories of self-employment over the past 2 years. Obviously, that is connected to COVID, but the overall trajectory is that this is a form of work that is on the rise in a serious way, and particularly among women. So that's it.